The year was 2012, a somewhat new studio called Remedy releases Max Payne. To save on resources, they use comic book sequences instead of cutscenes, and the game's writer was literally used as the model on the character. But man, the slow-mo gameplay was so good and the story felt more like a weird dream thriller rather than a cop game. I replayed Max Payne 1 and 2 so many times on my shitty Pentium PC when I was a younger person. Then Remedy and Take-Two did a divorce, and Take-Two got the kids, and they did a sequel that is a pretty good shooter but was surprisingly grounded on its plot. So Remedy went, "F it, we will turn the weirdness to 11, and came together with their new partner Microsoft to release the bizarre mystery thriller action shooter Alan Wake, which is just mwah! Then they made the prototype for Alan Wake 2, and Microsoft was like, nah, no one wants that. So they made Quantum Break, a shooter game with extra-dimensional abilities that I never played because I could never get it to not run like garbage on my PC. That was a while ago, maybe some of these million things I own will do the trick now. But that does not matter now, since they took the weird paranormal mood of Alan Wake and the paranormal powers of Quantum Break to make Control, and it is amazing. It reminds me so much of everything that I liked of the ambience of Max Payne, and it is such an interesting piece of technology too, which gets us to today. Control is a game running on their next version of their Northlight engine, which, based on Quantum Break, tends to be quite heavy. For the higher-end folk, there's a lot of technology there, like some pretty interesting ray tracing like reflection techniques or full-blown ray tracing everywhere on PC, but much more knowledgeable people have already analyzed that in Digital Foundry, videos that I heartily recommend if you're into game graphic technology. However, as John and Alex explain in those videos, the effects come at a cost, and the game can run pretty terribly on base consoles, even for my standards. Back on the land of the PC, the settings screen actually allows you to disable a fair deal of those effects for a simpler experience that actually works really well on something like an integrated Vega 11 GPU, which is great. Good work, Remedy, you created a technologically impressive product. We have blocking options to screw up anyone on a cheaper PC. I wish this was more common. But I was curious about stuff weaker than that, such as my favorite Athlon 200GE and its much weaker Vega 3, which struggled on the lowest possible settings, and that gives me an excuse to talk about two things. The first is motion blur. Interestingly enough, even if you can disable most things, motion blur is always enabled and very annoying on low FPS. Considering the reputation of motion blur, that seems like a weird decision. Thankfully, the internet's collective dislike for motion blur means that there's already a mod to disable it. Link in the description. Installing is as easy as extracting the files on the installation directory of the game and then hitting F4 in-game to disable the blur. Now, the performance impact of this is small, but definitely there, as I definitely noticed speaker performance drops when shaking the camera around when motion blur was enabled. And knowing you guys, more than one of you will find this useful, if not for performance reasons. Let's talk about render resolution. Like many other games currently being released, Control allows 3D elements to render at a lower resolution and then scale it back up to feel the full resolution with decent effects. Control does the same, but they seem to use some sort of temporal scaling, meaning that they use information of previous frames as well, for rather surprising effects in terms of visual fidelity for low resolutions. Now, the bad thing is that rather than a scale or multiplier like most games with this feature, you select a direct resolution to scale up from, and the list on most GPUs I have tested is a bit scarce. Thankfully, if you go to whatever the game is installed, there's a file called renderer.ini. These two lines control the render resolution, and so far the game seems to take almost every 16:9 resolution I threw at it. Initially, the Athlon 200GE, Vega 3, and the 2666 MHz of dual-channel RAM could not pull 20 FPS in a completely static scene at a native 720p, but changing the render resolution lines to 960 by 540 obviously starts seeing an improvement in performance, and surprisingly the visual impact is not as dramatic as you would expect for such a cut in the resolution. This is of course not enough. So we now go for render resolution of 768 by 432. This is not the first time I use this resolution, heck, I have used it as a full render resolution rather than just for 3D elements in the past, but it usually takes a very visually clean game where games are easy to see against the background for that to work. Control is not really one of those games, as the color palette can be a bit subdued, and yet the temporal scaling just looks great. Like, you won't fool anyone into thinking this is 720p, but this is not bad at all. Performance on Control is not super consistent because its combat gets crazy, flashy and messy, with pieces of elements breaking off with every shot. And yet, even on the worst combat I have found on this game so far, the Athlon 200G at that resolution seems to be able to keep over 30 FPS. While it does look like it's in a lower resolution, its scaler is definitely a category above what the other games can do. Don't expect any fancy visuals, but the gameplay and story of this game is preserved. So if you're like me and wanted to see what Remedy got in store this time, maybe these small tips can help you.